All right, YouTube, welcome to the Tradcast number 5. My guest this week is Levi from the Trad Dads podcast, and I really need to change the name of this live stream at some point. So if you have any recommendations for it that aren't tongue-in-cheek, put them in the comments. We're going to be talking today about the common good, what that is not, and what that means in the life of the typical Catholic. So if you have questions in the chat, go ahead and post them. We have Super Chat enabled for the first time pretty much ever. Just a note about Super Chat. YouTube's policy is if Super Chats that are, shall we say, edgy or inflammatory about protected classes will actually be deleted. The money will be taken from you and will be given not to the person you're trying to donate it to, in this case, this channel, but to a lobbying organization for that protected group. So, for example, if you don't want your money going to the ADL, maybe you should be wise about how you about the nature of your super chat commentary. So, with that having been said and gotten out of the way, I'm going to introduce our guest. Again, it's Levi from the Trad Dads podcast. I put a link to their channel in the community section of this channel yesterday. I can put another one if people want. Welcome, Levi. How are you today?
Doing well, thanks. Glad to be here and glad to be talking about the common good. I just want to clarify one thing. There are two Levis sometimes on the Trad Dads podcast, and I'm the sort of normal host, and so I not the Canadian guy. So
why don't you start us by telling us what you actually talk about frequently on your channel, because you seem to cover a wide variety of things. I saw you did a video on usury the other day, and you went pretty deep. But you also talk about like the life of faith from what the most recent episode looks like.
Yeah. So we kind of cover just things that we think are kind of important for Catholic men, and specifically Catholic fathers. Younger Catholic fathers. I'm in my early 30s, and the other two guys that are on the show are around my age. And, we just cover things that are kind of in our own wheelhouses, or just talk about kind of, issues that, fathers deal with. So for instance, we did an episode on pets. None of us are really all that big on pets in general, but we kind of talked about sort of the sometimes the challenges and the difficulties of pets in general, and sort of the kind of crummy way that people, sort of latch onto pets and use them as a replacement for children and stuff like that in our generation. I'm an economist. I have a PhD in economics. And so I tend to talk a lot about economics when it's just me on the show. But it's always about some kind of important moral component to the economics. I try to, it's not just, commentary about the Dow Jones Industrial Average or something. It's like the example with usury, it was just me kind of talking about some things that I'd been reading related to interest, and kind of what would happen if we got rid of interest, and how usury works and stuff like that. And then there's other times where we'll have Isaac on, and he has a master's degree in theology. And so he typically brings in a little bit more Catholic theology type issues, and stuff like that. So we have a lot of fun with it. And of course, I'm obviously open to suggestions for episodes for any of us to talk about. But we don't really do sort of like your channel is more, obviously commentary based and stuff like that. We're not really commenting on sort of like day-to-day or news type stuff. We're just kind of talking about, big issues that are relevant. So.
So because you're an economist, I want to just get this obvious question out of the way for you before we get onto our topic. The GDP is obviously the perfect measure of economic health and social prosperity, correct?
Yeah, no, it's not. It's been such a challenge for me over the past year or so, as I've kind of come to grips with the sort of divide between the morality implied by the sort of mainstream economics, and even non-mainstream economics, the Austrian stuff like that or whatever, and a more authentic, moral grounding, especially a Catholic one. And it was several months ago. It just kind of hit me. That's like, I can either be, a faithful Catholic, or I can, compromise on a dozen different things with, this sort of classical liberal, mainstream economics point of view. And so GDP, is a good example of this, right? So, it's not a perfectly accurate measure of even what people think it is, right? So,
right. The GDP is the gross domestic product, and that's just functionally the dollar value. Basically, it's the dollar value of everything the country produces.
Well, it's the dollar value of all final goods and services. Yes.
And remember, we live in a country that is heavily into the finance economy now. So that number is going to get grossly distorted when you start really adding in just the way the banking system and the currency system works now in the United States and abroad.
Yeah, and so there are several technical problems with it. Like, for instance, we have something called hedonic adjustments, where like if your television gets quote unquote better, right? In other words, it gets more technologically advanced. Well, how do you account for the difference in the quote unquote value of that good, right? So like a TV in 1965 is not nearly as good as one in 2019. And so, how do we account for the increase in value of that good?
Right.
Because it's not just the price, right? Because the production process is more efficient now. So there's a lot of hand waving. But on top of that, it's sort of the way I sort of think about it. I mean, even as an economist, it's like, okay, well, we have GDP, but what should my utility function for that GDP look like? In other words, if I'm going to be a moral person, how should I think about how important that GDP growth is? And if the things that give me better GDP growth are going to diminish some other good thing in my life, well then I may not be able to put that into an economic equation.
Right. So let me give you an example of this that will hit home to my audience who tends to really care about the moral issues in plain language. So the pornography industry in the United States is probably making more money now than they've ever have. And from a purely utilitarian standpoint, that's probably a good thing. From anybody who cares about the common good, that's not a good thing. So I want to use that as a bit of a segue to talk about what the common good is, which is our topic for the day. So how would you describe the common good in sort of a Catholic social teaching frame? Because, we're, trying to live in accordance with what the church has always taught.
Yeah. So the way I want to think about this, and as an economist, I'm going to frame it a certain way, but the common good is it's something that is, in sharing it, it's not diminished. Mm-hmm. So we can think about the miracle of the loaves and the fishes, right? Mm-hmm. So that as people shared, they broke the bread, and as they shared the fish, there was more and more of it, right? And at the end, they were collecting whole baskets full of both of those things, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, so the common good, sort of the ultimate common good, is the beatific vision, right? It's being in the presence of God. It's the Eucharist, right? So if there's a large community of Catholics, in your society, in your community, well, and they're all receiving the Eucharist after having gone to confession, all that sort of thing. Well, it's not like I've got this watch, on my wrist. Well, I have this watch, and that means you can't, right? Mm-hmm. And if we try to divide it up, then we've broken the watch, and now it doesn't work, right? Right. It's much less valuable. But the Eucharist is more valuable the more people use it.
Yes, right? I want to give you a couple definitions from some of the official writings of the church on this.
Sure.
The common good, from the encyclical Mater et Magistra, which is John the 23rd, 1961 encyclical. For those of you not conversant in Latin, its title means mother and teacher. Quote, the common good is the complete development of all the people of the world. John the 23rd describes it as the sum total of conditions of social living, whereby persons are enabled more fully and readily to achieve their own perfection. And of course, in the achievement of your own perfection in this case is going to be the, classical, in more classical language, this is the pursuit of sanctity. That's the first thing the church is concerned about. It's not, social justice, which is, by the way, a term the church invented and then it got flipped on its head by the world. But it's sanctity. and anything that violates your ability to achieve sanctity and for your family to achieve sanctity is a violation of the common good and a violation of social justice as the church understands it.
Right.
So you've got some conciliar documents here, but you've got there's the Bishops' Conference of England and Wales sort of understood this concept in the idea of interdependency. They say it's because we are an interdependent, the common good is more like a multiplication sum, where if any one number is 0, then the total is always 0. If anyone is left out and deprived of what is essential, I think that's a very important caveat there, essential, then the common good has been betrayed. And a lot of people go, well, that sounds socialist. But we're like, well, one of the things people forget is that we live in a world now where everything is either done by a for-profit corporation or by the government. And really, we're forgetting that there's also this place where you and I are supposed to be doing things to work for the common good in our everyday lives. That's the concept of subsidiarity, basically, in Catholic social teaching, which is where things should be taken care of at the lowest level possible of authority, possible. And you and I have authority to do things and working for the common good by doing things like loving our neighbor, literally our neighbor. It's kind of an essential part of the common good.
Yeah, and so I think there's a few things you can add into that. So, for instance, so what are these things that, like you said, necessities, right? The things that we need. And so a good example of that could be like equal protection under the law, right? And that's something that's just sort of assumed so that we can go about our daily lives properly, right? So that, if I'm going to pass something on to my children, or if I'm going to, make a transaction with someone in a market, we have to have, equal protection under the law. Typically governments provide us with currencies, right? And at the very least, again, they give us this sort of legal framework in which a currency can thrive. And so, those are things that are sort of essential. Those are essential pieces for us to live a virtuous life, right? In this sort of imperfect world we live in, right? And so those would be sort of, those things foster the common good, and the common good itself is, in terms of political context, is what every person in a polis, in a political society, ought to intend to create a just society. Right. And so, we have to think about sort of, people, it's okay for certain people in that polis to have different things based on different amounts of things, different, GDP, right, or different income based on their different stations in, their different roles. So, for instance, the president has a set of bodyguards, right? Has a secret service that is not afforded to anyone else in the same way, right? And that's in virtue of his office, right? He needs to be protected in a certain way, and that protection that we pay for, right? So it's not socialism. It's commonly provided, but it's not just simply doled out to whoever, right? It's not arbitrary. It's given to him because of his office. And, so you can think about, and sort of thinking about it the other direction. So like children, right? So children are not, there's a sort of partial citizens, right? They don't fully have their own agency in the legal framework. But, insofar as they do their parents' will, they are participating in the common good. And I think what confuses this stuff is sort of the language of economics when we talk about goods, right? Goods and services. And yes, food and all of these things are goods that we need, and they foster the common good, insofar as we have virtue, right? So, there's certainly a possibility that in an alternate, version of the current world, we could have we could have a set of circumstances where people are much materially poorer. But where there's a lot more virtue, right? Where everybody goes to daily mass and this sort of thing. And so that society would have more of the common good than ours would.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm thinking also it's hard for me to think that a culture or a society like the one we live in that has, abortion available on demand almost everywhere and anywhere is going to be ranking high on any kind of common good scale that you could measure.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on something you said about your, like, literally, you said, literally your neighbor.
Hmm.
And I think this is kind of an interesting insight that that kind of can help us understand where we ought to be on sort of these political spectrums and stuff like that. And so we often hear these two words in Catholic social teaching, subsidiarity and solidarity.
Hmm.
And it's very interesting if you if you look through the all the transcripts of talks and encyclicals and stuff from Pope Francis. You get a lot more of solidarity and very little subsidiarity, right?
I've one of the things that I've seen. I don't remember who the American Catholic commentator was, but they pointed out that the Republican Party is very good at subsidiarity, at least on paper, and the Democratic Party is very good at solidarity, but they both lack in the other value. And
Right. And I think what's really key about this is that when you separate the two, that's when you have the problem, right? So they actually work together, right? So solidarity is sort of this mutual fellow feeling that everyone in a community has for each other, right? And of
Mhm.
course we have cognitive limits on, the number of people we can share an authentic community with, right? So that gets to your point about being, your actual neighbor, right? So we can't have, this whole globalist idea of like, well, we're all just, sort of I'm a citizen of the world, right? Well, that just can't happen. For you to be an authentic citizen, you have to have some kind of connection to the other people. You have to have some kind of feeling of belonging to them, and you just simply can't do that with all 7 billion or however many people there are on the planet, right? Um,
Right.
and it's more appropriate for you to sort of care more about the well-being of your family and maybe the people in your neighborhood and the people in your community, your town or city, than the people in some other city far away, right? And part of that's just because that's just a limitation we have. Like people just cannot. We're just not wired that way. And I think Aquinas would have some good things to say about why we're wired that way. But the other thing is subsidiarity.
I actually,
Go ahead. Sorry.
oh, go ahead. Oh, well,
Well,
I've got some of St. Thomas Aquinas's thoughts on the common good, or as he called it, the common weal. Um, let's see. Where is it on this? Oh, here we go. He says, actions are indeed concerned with particular matters, but those particular matters are referable to the common good, not as to a common genus or species, but as to a common final cause, according as the common good is said to be the common end. This is a more precise definition than you're going to see in the Catholic Compendium of Social Doctrine, a tome of a book on Catholic social teaching that I have, given my sort of scholarly interest, I guess. He says that where I'm looking at this also make references that the sum total cannot mean a mere aggregate of things. It's not common good is not a utilitarian calculus of the greatest possible conditions for the greatest number of social beings. For St. Thomas, it's an ordered totality, a totality of parts working together in one uniform way for a common goal. The common aspect in common good is not a catalog or an IHOP restaurant menu. This is a really cool article, actually, with a million individual options. It is the organic unity of varied and sundry parts working together for one end. And remember, since it's about justice. This is a quote from from various parts of the Summa. Justice, as stated above, directs man in his relations with other men. Now it is evident that all who are included in a community stand in relation to that community as parts to a whole, while a part as such belongs to a whole, so that whatever is the good of a part can be directed to the good of the whole. It follows, therefore, that all acts of virtue can pertain to justice, insofar as it directs man to the common good. It is in this sense that justice is called a general virtue, and since it belongs to the law to direct to the common good, as stated above, it follows that the justice, which is in this way styled general, is called legal justice, because thereby man is in harmony with the law, which directs the acts of all the virtues to the common good. So what we're talking about with the common good is essentially we're talking about it's sort of a measure of justice, really. And do you live in a just society when you have involuntary homelessness? And I have to always couch it that way because I've met a number of homeless people who seem quite happy with their lot in life. Yeah. There are people like that out there, and I won't hold it against them.
Right, and so I think this is a good way to kind of frame things. I think because you can obviously go too far in either direction, right? So subsidiarity Just definitionally, it's just sort of the idea that the lowest or the smallest political unit of society should control, whatever is appropriate or whatever they can handle before a higher or bigger unit handle something. So, for instance, education of children, maybe we let families handle that, right? Or maybe at the very most a community, but it's certainly not just for the federal government to design and direct all education throughout the entire country. Whereas
and then use it as a means of social conditioning beyond what would be good.
Right. Yeah,
and, there are a number of stories coming out of public schools now that we don't need to recount here that are moral and often the subject of headlines on LifeSite News and other places like that.
Right. Well, and I think that's the thing too. So, if we think now something that would be, appropriate for a national government would be national defense, right? I mean, it's in the name. For it to be national defense, it has to be handled in some fashion by, sort of the largest body, in society, right? And so I think again, what happens is that these two things actually play together, right? So that so that solidarity is fostered by a system that obeys subsidiarity, right, or uses subsidiarity as its sort of defining principles, right? And so when a family is allowed to is sort of empowered politically to do what is right for them to do, for them to contribute to the common good, then they are able to contribute to the common good and they're able to foster that solidarity. But I think what happens is, we have lefties that say, well, solidarity is the only thing that matters and who cares about subsidiarity, right? So this is all the sort of like nationalist, or sorry, not nationalist, sorry. All this like, socialist stuff where the national government's going to do everything, right? And then the other direction you can go is just to say, well, solidarity will just work itself out. We don't need to, the political system doesn't need to foster any kind of unity, right? We can just the market will sort that out or some nonsense, right?
Yeah, this is where the fetishizing of the market comes in,
right? And so all we focus on is the subsidiarity angle, right? And so anytime you talk about some political unit in society needing to do something, you're automatically met with, well, what are you, a socialist? Why would you want the federal government to do X, Y, Z? And it's like, well, first of all, I don't want the federal government to fix potholes on my streets, but I certainly want the local government to do that. I don't want to do that, right? I mean, that's, the roads are commonly held, and that's okay, So I think when the sort of what Catholic social teaching expects of us is to sort of marry those two together and to understand how, how policy and, our own productivity and our own use of markets in a moral fashion can push us in the direction of the common good.
Yeah, I'm thinking of this in terms of, well, one, the sort of that, the ever ongoing national healthcare debate in the United States, where I'm not against national healthcare as a concept. I dislike the concept of, nationalized health insurance because I don't think that solves the problem. But I have, issues with a society that utterly lacks virtue, enabling its government, which utterly lacks virtue, to then make the life and death decisions for its own citizens in that way. And I don't know how to reconcile those things, because on the flip side, this way things are set up now isn't exactly just either. It doesn't contribute to the common good. In fact, it severely undermines the common good. So if you have a system where people can go bankrupt from medical bills, that's a problem.
Yeah, so I actually am reasonably well read on this subject, and essentially, it's one of these frustrating things, right? Where we're forced into these binaries, right? It's like either we can have the British system where the government is murdering children, or we can have an oligarchy of the insurance companies, right, that dictate care and overpay hospitals and all of this sort of thing. Yeah. But the funny thing is that in in the memory of the past 2 generations, there was a system in the United States, and I hate to even call it a system really, because it was very subsidiarity focused. And there's a book, and I'm going to look it up while I'm talking here. There was a system that was essentially run on the local and community level. And what it was is you had organizations like, the Elks Lodge or something, right? But
the word, let's not let the word lodge excuse me, let's not let the word lodge make people think we're talking about like Masonic organizations or anything.
Yeah, right, of course.
These are like your grandpa's drinking and cigar club that does charitable work.
Another one you could use is the Fraternal Order of Police.
Right.
So these were sometimes occupation-based organizations, and sometimes they were just social clubs, right? And in some places where there were sort of ethnic enclaves, maybe there were like, Black-only organizations in the South. And these existed basically through the 1940s.
And honestly, at one point, the Knights of Columbus probably took care of some of these things too, because the Knights of Columbus used to be I feel like a much more dynamic, I want to say, organization than they seem to be now. But
the Knights is actually a really interesting case of this. So the Knights have done basically what a lot of these organizations did. So the Knights went from sort of providing explicit aid to widows to becoming basically an insurance company. And so, I'm not condemning them, right? They're just doing what they have to do. But there's an example in Topeka, Kansas, and this is in this book. So here's the name of the book: From Mutual Aid to the Welfare State, Fraternal Societies and Social Services, 1890 to 1967. Now, obviously, that's an academic book. I think it was the guy's dissertation. His name is David T. Beito, B-E-I-T-O. Not Beto O'Rourke, but it's a fantastic book because it basically takes you through this period of time in the U.S. where we had these fraternal societies. And like I said, I'll take one example from this organization called Securities Benefit in Topeka, Kansas. And it has since become sort of an insurance company, life insurance, I believe. And what they did, so they had their sort of, normal activities, and fun for the families and all this sort of thing, right? And, or, dad drinking kind of thing, whatever. But what you would do is if you had 2 or 3 days wages, you could get medical care up to minor surgery for your whole family, with 2 or 3 days wages. And the way it would work is these organizations would kind of would contract a doctor, a physician. And so, even if you couldn't pay, like, let's say, you couldn't make your payment, this 3 month, this quarter, right? Well, we'd let it slide. Right. But, after a point in time, again, there's this community built around this service. Right. And so people were kind of like, hey, look, man, you need to pay. Like, we're all trying to benefit from this, and we're going to lose our doctor if you don't, you need to contribute. And so there's sort of a policing that happens because the community is there. Mm-hmm. And essentially what happened to these organizations was, number one, the American Medical Association and state medical boards basically destroyed them. So in the 1920s, the AMA was successful in reducing the number of medical schools in the United States dramatically, which reduced the number of doctors, pushing up doctors' wages. And then the hospitals and the administrators of those hospitals at the state level basically went on propaganda campaigns to, say how dirty and evil these, these lodge medicine, they called it lodge medicine, how evil this lodge medicine practice was. And then you have things like, the payroll taxes being put on, I think in the 60s is when they were really ramped up. But payroll taxes, so, taxing your dollar, your money income. But then, of course, employers are going to try to compete for talent. And so the way they did it was they said, okay, well, it costs us money if we just increase the cash salary, but but we can offer these fringe benefits that are exempted from the taxes in the law, right? So we'll just offer everybody, these nice insurance packages. And so that's when your health insurance got tied to your job. And so, now you can tell the story either way you want, right? You can say, oh, look, the evil insurance companies did blah, blah, blah. Or you can say, look, the government, didn't do its job and it incentivized this horrible practice, right? But whoever you put the blame on, the bottom line is we had a massive, usurpation of, legitimate local, solidarity or subsidiarity. And it caused a massive rift in society that has harmed our solidarity. And so, we're stuck in this binary now. But the funny thing is, it's like, so you can go to, there's organizations like Atlas MD that's empowering doctors to basically just get rid of their insurance practices. And you go cash, and it's a sort of a monthly fee for care from the doctor. And it's very inexpensive. I mean, just for me, just for my family, I think $450 a month is my premium. And then of course my employer pays some too. But you can get these plans, and they're like, $60 per adult and like $20-$30 a month per child. And then, you get a catastrophic plan. And thankfully we've got Christian organizations building these catastrophic plans. And now what about hospitals, right? So, so it's interesting. If you go to Oklahoma City, there is a clinic there called the Surgery Center of Oklahoma, and I'm convinced that someday, some HHS secretary is going to have these guys raided and put in prison. But basically, what they do is, if you go to their website, they will tell you how much it costs to have knee surgery or whatever you need.
Imagine that, the ability to know how much you might need to pay if you just want to cut them a check.
Right. Exactly. And so now they don't do insurance because, of course, you got to have a whole flock of people to deal with the insurance bureaucracy. And so they just have, good grief, right? They just have a medical staff. Imagine that.
They have a medical staff and a couple of clerical staff to handle the people at the door.
And the prices are like all inclusive. They include all the anesthesia and all that stuff. There's none of this, tacking things on. So it's just one of these things where like people just have to get out of this silly binary. And it's not like, magical third way, blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, there's in the concrete recent past, we had a completely different way of doing things that was, I think, more consistent with a Christian conception of the common good, and certainly more consistent with Catholic social teaching in terms of subsidiarity and solidarity. And we've just allowed, the government and the interests that lobby them, put the blame on whoever you want. I don't care. The point is that happened, and we have to figure out, I think, how to get around it. And the way it's happening is, these brave doctors are just coming out and saying, look, I'm just going to go to cash practice. And the states that allow them to do it are allowing them to do it. And they've got, there's an organization called the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons or something like that. And they are lobbying state governments to allow, these cash practices to exist.
I wish them the best of luck in their battle against the insurance lobby.
Yeah, you bet. You bet.
I'm just wondering how much, if this is the rise of this practice, what you described with the destruction of lodge medicine, as they called it, how that coincided with the sudden prevalence of usury in the United States in the post-war period.
Yeah. So, I've been reading a lot more on usury lately, and I think that it really is sad that we don't have more guidance on the concept of usury from the hierarchy. We have a handful of encyclicals, or not even really that, just letters and stuff like that.
I think you're going to have a hard time with the American hierarchy doing that, because they are so in bed with the federal government to get ridiculous amounts of money from the federal government for the various federal programs they run.
So my question to you is sort of what did you have in mind? You're talking about this rise of usury after the Second World War. What specific thing are you talking about there?
I'm thinking about just the intersection here of the various financial interests the rise of debt culture in the United States, because most people don't realize that the first credit card didn't really come into existence until the 1950s. Yes, credit existed, and you can get credit at places before that, but a walking credit slip in your pocket that was good at most anywhere, that was a thing that didn't show up until the 1950s, and that's when
you're saying
that's when debt started exploding at every level of society, was in the post-war period.
Right. So that, I think that makes, I see what you're saying now. So it's not as if, people all of a sudden, started charging higher interest rates or whatever. And I think that's a bad definition of usury anyway, but yeah, you're right. This is one interesting way to think about this is if we go to, GDP and technological progress, right? And we think about these concepts. Well, here's one example of, technological progress that really has probably harmed to a large extent sort of the moral fabric and the common good of the public, right? So, what's the key factor there, right? What makes it so you can have, a line of credit in your pocket? Well, you have to have a certain amount of technology for that, right? So, certainly the legal framework that gives us, sort of just commerce and allows us to improve our lives that way, can also be used to, create, with the use of telephone lines and all that stuff, which again can be good, can give us credit cards, right? And so they, you just need, all you need is a phone line. These days, heck, it's, all you need is a phone and one of those little swiper things for the phone, right?
Yeah.
And people just sort of treat credit cards indistinguishably from their bank accounts.
It's not even that. Like, if you pay attention the next time you're shopping, or the next few times you're shopping, and notice how different you may react when you're paying with even your debit card, not your credit card, but your debit card, versus cash in your wallet.
Yeah.
And notice how your spending habits change when you're actually holding even that silly fiat currency that people will say doesn't have any value of its own. Even just the tangible difference between spending of the $20 in your wallet versus $20 that you're using from your debit card. There is an attitude change. Most people experience that when they're trying to spend more with cash than with plastic.
And it's just one of these things where it just shows you to an extent how sort of unnatural this kind of thing is, and it reminds me of my conversion. I didn't grow up Catholic, but the idea of sacramentals was really interesting to me, because so I wear the brown scapular and the green scapular, and it's like just having this physical thing, even in its very simple role as just a reminder to pray. It's like we are visceral beings, right? We need sort of physical contact with things for us to really understand them. And yeah, when it's just a piece of plastic that it's the same piece of plastic whether it's worth $20,000 or 20 cents.
Mm-hmm.
And it just doesn't operate with our bodies the way that even something like you said, cash. Whatever. It gets inflated to an extent, or loses its value, sure, but it just seems like so much less of an odd deviation than a debit card or a credit card is.
Yeah, and I think you pretty much these days have to be asleep at the wheel to not realize that we're not just talking, as a debt culture, we're not talking about the national debt, although that's a terrifying number. Like, I can't even fathom the 21 trillion or something it is now, or what the effect that's going to have on, economic growth in the future, and just people's quality of life. But, individual debt, whether it's student loans or medical debt or credit card debt or anything else that generally prevents you from, just giving your family a better life experience. There are people out there who can't make, their basic ends meet because they have a credit card bill to pay, because they, a few years earlier did something really stupid, like partied all the time with their credit card or something.
Right. I think there's certainly a case to be made that, the availability of credit like this, it allows people to really, or it makes it so much easier for them to lose sight of their virtues. But just purely from an economic standpoint as well. So we think about, sort of the rising cost of different things like, home values, or tuition rates. And these things have risen because, because credit is so cheap, because rates are so low. And so if we just artificially set the rate of interest for these, student loans at some low fixed amount, then of course, the cost of the underlying asset that we're borrowing to buy is going to rise.
Do you know what the interest rate is for student loans? I think right now it's about high 6, low 7%.
Yeah, I think depending on different types, it was between 6.25% and 7.25%, I think.
Yeah, and that sounds low if we're compared to like, the kind of credit card most people who are, freshmen through juniors in college are probably getting, because those can go up to like, I think legally 29% right now. But
yeah, right.
7%, when you're talking like say $60,000 at a private school, your federal loan at 7% is still a pretty significant chunk of change every year being added.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And there's all these different ways that they're not solving the problem. They're just kind of kicking the can down the road, because there's all these different, like, the payments are deferred while you're in school. And it's like, my goodness, compound interest can just sneak up on you way faster than you can imagine.
Yeah, I know that with the deferred payments for subsidized loans, they don't start accruing interest until you are out of school and out of your grace period. Then they start accruing interest. But this is why I briefly worked in a financial aid department of a university before my conscience got to me. And it was I always advise people to do what I didn't do when I was in college because I was dumb, and that's throw any money you can at it, whether it's $5 a month or $100 a month, whatever you can. If you're taking a loan, if you do that, that you will be very thankful at the end that you did, because you may end up paying for like 3 or 4 years of interest, or preventing 3 or 4 years of interest, and buying yourself time to pay the thing off faster.
And there's and I think, you're starting to hear phrases like K through 16 education, and it's like,
that's because of perpetual childhood.
Sure, but I think the thing is like this sort of, there's two things that feed off of each other, right? It's the parents telling the kids, not letting their kids grow up, right? Not treating a 12-year-old like a 12-year-old and a 16-year-old like a 16-year-old. They're treating them all like 6-year-olds, right? And trying to sort of helicopter them, or one or the other extreme, right? Being helicopter parents, or just letting them do whatever the heck they want, and not trying to get them to understand boundaries.
And honestly, it even comes to little things like not questioning your 17 or 18-year-old kid when they come home with a new comic book character T-shirt, or when they should start be thinking about just presenting themselves as as a grown man or as a grown woman. I don't know. This can go deviate into so many areas, like modesty and what it actually means and everything else, because the common good is such a almost vague or all-purpose term that it's more of an umbrella term that can cover almost everything that isn't ill in the culture today.
Yeah, and I think maybe to be a little more specific with it, I think it goes back to understanding your place in the polis, right? In the political society, and so I think it gets into some of these interesting things like identity, right? And so it's certainly legitimate to think of yourself differently when you become, like in our case, a father, right?
Yeah.
Your role in society is different, right? Now you are tasked with providing for and forming the consciences of, future citizens, right? And so it's one of these things where, perhaps it would foster the common good for, for employers to sort of pay their employees based on, their status as a single person, or a father of 2, or a father of 4, or whatever.
Yeah, you're going back to the old what the church has always advocated for, which is the family wage, which ruffles a lot of the feathers of a lot of Americans, because it, while while I definitely understand and in some cases will champion the idea of, just absolute merit, the family way, ultimately family is the cornerstone of society, then it should take primacy in pretty much everything.
Well, and so there's a few things to say. So number one, it is merit, right? It's just merit in the sense that, if the employer sees themselves as, just simply, somebody who's just, a building with a factory in it, right? Well, okay, but if they see themselves as part of the community, right, that the thing that they're producing is for the good of society, right? Then of course they would want, to pay their employees in accordance with the good of society as well, right? In accordance with the common good. And so it's not, and you get this from, sort of there's always an argument about the market, right? And it's like, look, market prices are contingent on our morality. Market prices don't just come down to us on stone tablets, right? They are the result of a moral process, right? Where people will simply say something like, look, I'm just, for instance, I mean, just think about something very simple, like buying a car, right? You have a certain set of moral principles around that purchase, right? Number one, you're not going to buy from somebody you don't like. You're not going to pay sticker price, right? I mean, there's conventions in society. Most employers, we all know that we have tips. So you pay wait staff less than, a normal minimum wage, right? And maybe that's not just, but the point is there is a moral framework there, right? Like I should tip if the service is good. And so contingent on that, the employer makes a certain offer of pay to the wait staff. And so, it's one of these things where it has nothing to do with sort of opposition to the market as this, nebulous, thing, right? It's what it does is it's contrary to an ideology based on the market. And so, for instance, if we have, well, let me say one more thing, sort of purely economic about this. So there's an economist, excuse me, named Arnold Kling, who he's a great blogger, and he has a PhD in economics, but he talks about the fact that, when we make this reference to, market wages and all this sort of thing, if we're talking about, what someone ought to be paid, right? We say the wage equals the marginal product of labor, right? Well, the problem there is that no one could ever actually compute a marginal product of labor unless the person is actually producing the product directly. But for Pete's sake, most of us, our jobs are basically overhead.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's no way to compute, a marginal product. There's no way to really know, that person's marginal contribution. And so, then you say, oh, well, the market just, tends toward that level. And it's like, well, yeah, in theory, but in the real world, these things are always in flux, right? The target is always moving. And so I think there's a way to sort of baptize Hayek, and some of these market thinkers and sort of bring their insights to something reasonable here. But,
whoever does that successfully does that maybe in the future the Thomas Aquinas of economics.
Well, Thomas Aquinas, a lot of his followers had some good things to say about starting economics. So
yeah,
that's really helpful. But so, so let me come up with we have an episode of the Trad Dads podcast where we talked about the minimum wage. And one of the examples we got was a firm. It's a techie type firm. And what they would do is, people would have like, a basic salary that would be, whatever. And then you would let them know how many dependents you had, right? So, maybe this is a little bit better concept than just, how many children you have. Well, how many dependents do you have? Well, my wife doesn't work, so she would be one of my dependents. My mother-in-law staying with us, so she's a dependent. So you would get a bonus that was baked into your paycheck based on how many dependents you had. And it was like $2,000 or $3,000 per dependent. And so, they had, two guys, had the same basic salary, but if one of them had 3 dependents and the other one had 1, well, the guy with the 3 dependents got paid more. And to me, this is all to the common good. This is perfectly in line with, sort of, it's perfectly just for the employer to be able to pay these people different rates on whatever, certainly on this basis, right? Certainly on the basis of their sort of contribution to the common good, right? And the guy with 3 kids is contributing more to the common good than the one with 1 kid.
I'm reminded of, for some reason, I'm reminded of something that I remember from, I think it's from Rerum Novarum, Pope Leo XIII's groundbreaking encyclical that pretty much kicked off the modern social teaching encyclicals of the church, though he did talk about social issues well before he released that encyclical. And that's where, in the section where he's talking about organized labor, because when he's talking about organized labor in there, he's not talking about the kind of labor unions that we could think of today. The first principle of the organized labor, or one of the grounding principles, is that they should protect the faith of the worker. And in addition to negotiating with the labor, the collectively bargaining for a better, more just wage from the employer, they're also protecting the faith of the worker. And that's one of those things that seems lost on us today.
Well, certainly, beating up scabs, right? The people who crossed the picket lines was not preserving the faith of the employee, right?
Right. But so it's, when we're talking about the common good, people need to always remember the life of faith and how how our civilization actually either assaults the life of faith or strengthens or enables us to live fuller lives of achieving sanctity. Because remember, the common good is essentially the ability for everyone to achieve sanctity, and to achieve sanctity, your basic essential needs need to be taken care of. You're not hungry unless you're fasting voluntarily. You're not, homeless unless you're doing so voluntarily. You're not suffering unnecessarily because of some sort of social condition. And it's one of those principles that makes a lot of people, uncomfortable today, because we live in a hyper individualistic society. Even our socialists are bizarrely individualistic. Just go listen to them talk about, my truth. Go listen to them talk about, identifying as X, whatever that is, the gender debate going on and everything else. So, and a lot of that stuff.
No, I completely agree with you on the whole individual. I'm not educated well enough on sort of the philosophical and political, ways of thinking to to really articulate why I think that's individualistic. but yeah, I agree with you. It's very, it really has become sort of an extension of sort of the me generation kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, we walk around with these little devices that are effectively mirrors, and it's like, of course that's going to, result in a lot of narcissism or something like that, right?
Right. This is going to sound weird from a couple of guys on a podcast on YouTube saying this, but I saw a headline earlier today that made me just want to die inside, and it said that the number one desired career among Generation Z is to be a YouTuber. Part of me kind of died when I saw that.
Yeah, that's
because the stereotype of the YouTuber is, well, I mean, it can be pretty narcissistic. There's a reason. There's a number of reasons I don't appear on camera most of the time, even though I am going to move eventually towards doing that. But I don't want to make it a common, like my everyday practice, because my ego doesn't need any help. Right.
And Belloc with sunglasses looks cool anyway. So
well, you can thank one of our mutual colleagues for the original design of this. But I know originally if you go back to my earliest videos, I was using a really grossly pixelated version of Pope Pius XIII from The Young Pope, and then I briefly did a tour as Torquemada when the abuse scandal broke out last summer.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
Well, Inquisition when, as they say, but
right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's one of these things where I don't know if we really are justly blaming the parents or justly blaming, Gen Z itself. It's tough because obviously, children get a lot from their parents, but at the same time, there's a certain point when, you kind of, it's sort of incumbent on you to sort of snap out of it and recognize that, things aren't going to improve if you don't, figure out how to make that happen. And I think that fits in with the common good, right? The idea is that, we're not, we have a contribution to make, and as, malformed as our childhood could have been, or as bad as our current economic circumstances are, they can always be, they can be overcome, I think, in general. And there's we need communities to help with that, but we need to foster those communities. Did we lose him? I think we lost him. Well, I guess if Anthony's not here and people can still hear me, if you have questions or anything like that, please put them in the chat, and I'll try to address them if assuming we're still live here. Anthony, if you can hear me, I cannot hear you. Okay, good deal. Does anybody have questions or anything they want to bring up?